Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Conway Hall Ethical Society. We're the oldest ethical society in the UK. And today we're going to be talking, thinking on Sunday, Britain and borders. Borders are more than simply conceptual ideas. They actually truly affect people's lives. And we're going to look at that today. Now unusually we have two speakers. So what they'll each do is speak for kind of 25 minutes, half an hour each. I'll let you know their bios before each speaker. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session. So you can put your questions in the chat as we go along, less likely to be answered as we go along because the speaker's concentrating on their discussion. And then ask questions in the Q&A later on. If for any reason you're a bit, you don't want to answer the question yourself, that's absolutely fine. Let us know and I'll ask on your behalf. So now I'd like to go to our first speaker this afternoon. This is Nadine L Anneny, and she's a reader in law at Birkbeck School of Law and co-director for the Centre of Research on Race and Law. She's written for numerous publications, including The Guardian, the LRB blog, Open Democracy and Critical Legal Thinking. And her book, Bordering Britain, Race, Law and Empire, is published by Manchester University Press. She also co-edited the book After Grenfell, Violence, Resistance and Response, and co-authored Empire's Endgame, Racism and the British State. They're both published by Pluto Press. So for the next half an hour, we'll be in Nadine's company, and then we'll go to Leah after that. Over to you, Nadine.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Deborah, and also to everyone at Conway Hall for inviting me to speak at this event today, and to everybody for coming. And of course, I'm absolutely delighted to be sharing a platform with Leah today. So yeah, as Deborah said, I'm going to be speaking today about my book, Bordering Britain, Law, Race and Empire. And in doing so, I'm going to address how race science was at the core of British colonial rule, and how the contemporary British border is a legal fiction. Of course, it is one with very real and violent effects. I'm going to argue that the border was invented in part to erase from memory, or had the effect of erasing from memory, how Britain came to be one of the richest places in the world, and to justify its exclusion of those from whom it stole and subjugated in the course of the British Empire. So what follows is a retelling of Britain's history, one which challenges mythological narratives and hopefully allows for new imaginings for its future. So although law announces itself as a rational and neutral set of measures, it is necessarily based on fiction. What differentiates the violence enacted by law from the violence enacted outside of law is the idea that the enforcement of law is legitimate because it derives from sovereign power. Though proclaiming itself to be a secular state, the sovereign is often understood as being of a higher order than those subject to its power. All of this is fantasy, but one that is given form and substance through custom, institutions, legislation, and systems of government. The fantasy on which British, and more widely, European sovereignty is based is a particular kind of fantasy, a white Christian supremacist fantasy that drove heady white men in particular to traverse oceans and lands to conquer peoples, enslave them, massacre them, and steal their land and resources, enriching themselves and their families and descendants to come. So what is the connection between race science and bordering? Well, British imperial administrations depended on the exploitation of hierarchies based on supposed differences between categories of people. The use of race as an ordering principle played an important part in enabling and justifying colonialism. In order for colonists to conquer entire civilizations, they needed to be known and filed under terms familiar to the colonizer. Anglo-European scholars of the 1800s and 1900s provided the impetus for colonization in their repeated intellectual reductions of entire non-Anglo-European civilizations as being readable and translatable and ultimately inferior to Western civilization, and therefore could be conquered. By contrast, non-Western scholarship until today remains posited as an inferior generator of culture and knowledge. Prime among the criteria for knowing and ordering civilizations in the colonial era was race, which was invoked as an organizational category. The production and signification of the racial in post-Enlightenment era writing depended on the use of tools from science and history. There was a fixation in the Enlightenment period with categorization and classification of establishing what is inside and outside. On the question of who constituted humanity, this could only be ascertained by determining what lies outside of the human. And to this end, the context of European colonialism meant that understandings of humanity were based on a distinction between white Europeans and non-Europeans. The violence of colonialism is, though needless to say, not purely semantic. An extreme level of physical threat, force, and brutality was administered to maintain the British Empire. Colonizers have always been aware that despite their claim to have founded a durable order, that order rested on a reversible relation of forces. The possibility for the reversal of colonialism through the actions of resistance movements required extreme violence and its constant threat against subjugated populations. At the same time, dismissals and brutal crackdowns of struggles for self-determination in the colonies necessitated justifications that rested on constructions of difference and their accentuation in official discourse. The tendency in the Enlightenment era was to categorize nature and man into types, the exaggeration of which were assumed to be general features. The reduction of innumerable objects to orderable and describable types was applied with devastating consequences to people. Ideas about racial superiority and inferiority underpinned the division of cultures into civilized and uncivilized, and served as a normative justification for colonial conquest. For instance, British colonizers subjugated Aboriginal Australians and Native Americans, constructing them as having failed to socially progress, partly on account of their different relationship to land, and thereby justified colonial intervention, land dispossession, and rule. Within an Anglo-European understanding of linear time, Indigenous people were seen as being primitive, inhabiting a bygone era, one which Europeans had transcended. And there is, of course, a specificity to the version of white supremacy which underpinned British colonialism. Colonists operating at the height of the expansion of the British Empire propagated the idea that white British people were supreme over all other people, including other white Europeans who were engaged in their own colonial projects. In 1877, for instance, in Confessions of Faith, Cecil Rhodes wrote, "It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory, and we should keep this one idea steadily before our eyes, that more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, most honorable race the world possesses." Considering that Britain invaded 90% of the current 193 members of the United Nations, it is not difficult to imagine the depth of arrogance and political investment of British colonists in the idea of white British supremacy. So these ideas and practices of racial ordering that I've outlined are constitutive of contemporary British immigration law. By allocating life and death on the basis of whether or not a person meets the criteria for a legal status, and by preventing those who do not from accessing Britain, law is central to ongoing processes of colonial dispossession. Law is thus the structure which underpins Britain's claim to being an enclosed space within which resources and wealth obtained via colonial conquest belong to Britons conceived in large part as white. Law's categorization of people into groups, those with and without rights of entry and stay, makes the latter disproportionately at risk of violence and premature death. Immigration law thus falls within Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a legal geographer, her definition of racism as the state-sanctioned production of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Now, this definition is a bit of a mouthful, but it's important because it's a description of racism as being structurally produced, and it's helpful for understanding the way in which systems of meaning and control, of which law is one, distributes chances at life and death. It allows us to move away from a traditional discrimination law framework, which concentrates and requires the location of an individual who can be found to have intentionally discriminated, and shifts the focus instead onto harmful conditions that are experienced across populations that the state targets for violence and abandonment. The effect of law's division of people into groups with differentiated rights is to create hierarchies of people, some of whom have access to territory or to basic resources, a chance at survival, whilst others do not. And of course, the particular population immigration law targets for abandonment is the racialized poor, the vast majority of whom have personal, ancestral, or geographical histories of colonization. For racialized people, the border is neither easily navigable, nor is it temporally and spatially limited. Whiteness, as embodied racial power, is apparent in the ease with which most white people cross borders and move through white hegemonic spaces. White people tend not to be subject to stringent visa requirements and racial profiling, whereas the vast majority of racialized people are unable to purchase tickets for travel or to board planes due to visa rules and carrier sanctions, and are disproportionately stopped and searched at airports. This encounter with the border is itself a racializing process, as a result of which people are made disproportionately vulnerable to harm. People who do not have a right of entry to Britain are forced to undertake treacherous, often fatal journeys. The absence of a right of stay can mean homelessness, a lack of access to healthcare, the confinement to a camp or a detention center, or deportation. People in these conditions are at risk of being subjected to physical and mental violence and death. As the hostile environment policy demonstrates, racialized people also experience internal borders, which are invisible and permeable for most white people. Borders follow people around and surround them as they try to access work, welfare, health, and work protection. Sarah Keenan has shown how borders' attachment to racialized people means that they take with them the space of the border. She's a legal scholar, and in her work on race and time, she describes race as a temporal category to be understood in terms of how long racialized subjects are able to survive in the world. If we take this spatial and temporal understanding of British immigration law, it enables us to see how it works to place land resources, healthcare, welfare, security, and opportunities, all of which can be understood as modern day manifestations of stolen colonial possessions, out of reach of the vast majority of those with ancestral or geographical histories of colonization. Whilst categorization is important for the creation of meaning, it is the alignment of systems of categorization and the assertion of power that makes racial subjugation possible. We can understand migration law as a racial regime of power, as part of a colonial edifice, and it allows us to see the danger of accepting legal categories as given. While legal categories may be articulated in terms that are race neutral, their effect is to enable the colonial state to administer racial violence. Legal categories such as refugee and citizen end up legitimizing the incarceration and marginalization and expulsion and even death of those who are deemed not to fulfill the criteria required for the granting of these statuses. So the widespread acceptance of legal categories of people moving as defined in international and national law thus normalizes the racial violence in which the legal system is implicated. And this assumption that legal categories are neutral and fair works to mask the violence that they produce and sustain. So some unmasking is needed, that is, a telling of a more honest story of British immigration law and its relationship to colonial violence, one that will help us to challenge the fiction that Britain is a legitimately bordered sovereign nation state. Britain would not be the wealthy, plentiful place that it is today without its colonial history. Colonialism and slavery were key to its industrialization and the growth of its capitalist economy. In 1833, Britain abolished slavery only to raise the equivalent of £17 billion in compensation to be paid to British slave owners for the loss of their property. The funds paid out built and infused Britain's commercial, cultural, imperial, and political institutions. Wealth derived from British slave ownership has by no means been evenly distributed in Britain. It has helped to enrich and sustain elite institutions, individuals, and families, and has sown inequality deep into the fabric of British society, making it the most unequal place in Europe. Yet Britain's healthcare system, welfare state, transportation infrastructure, cultural and educational institutions, battered and unequally accessible as they are in the wake of privatization and austerity policies, are nevertheless colonially derived, along with the private wealth amassed over the course of the British Empire and retained after its defeat via systems of inheritance. To see how Britain came to be understood, not as what it is, the spoils of empire, but as a legitimately bordered sovereign nation state, we need to travel back to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, which are particularly important decades in the story of modern immigration law. As colonial populations fought the British from their territories, British lawmakers fast abandoned the myth of imperial unity and equality and moved to introduce controls targeted at racialized colonial subjects and Commonwealth citizens. This legislation culminated in the 1981 British Nationality Act, which raised for the first time the spectre of a post-imperial, territorially defined and circumscribed Britain. It severed a notionally white, geographically distinct Britain from the remainder of its colonies and the Commonwealth. Through the concept of patriality, invented for the purposes of the 1971 Immigration Act, whiteness was made intrinsic to British identity. Only patrials, those born in Britain or with a parent born in Britain, had a right of abode, meaning a right of entry and stay in Britain. In 1971, a person born in Britain was 98% likely to be white. The 1981 Act continued this process of racial exclusion by constructing British citizenship on the foundation of the 1971 Act's concept of patriality, tying citizenship to the right of entry and stay. Conservative Home Secretary at the time, William Whitelaw, said of the Act that it is time to dispose of the lingering notion that Britain is somehow a haven for all those whose countries we used to rule. The move was both materially and symbolically significant. A territorially distinct Britain and a concept of citizenship that made Britishness commensurate with whiteness made it clear that Britain, the landmass and everything within it, belongs to Britons conceived intrinsically as white. The 1981 Act did not therefore signify an end to British colonialism, but was itself a colonial maneuver. It was an act of appropriation, a final seizure of the wealth and infrastructure secured through centuries of colonial conquest. Understanding Britain as a contemporary colonial space in this way serves to partially collapse the distinction between settler and non-settler colonial contexts. We're used to seeing settler colonial contexts such as Australia and the US as ongoing colonial situations where land continues to be contested by Aboriginal and native populations. The same critique has not been applied to non-settler forms of colonialism, such as that in Britain, which is considered to have ended. Yet the border drawn around the spoils of British colonial conquest via immigration and nationality law amounts to an unredressed act of colonial theft. Due to mainstream understandings of property as being fixed and immovable in space and time, theft via the passing of immigration controls can be difficult to conceptualize. Along with the resources and labor stolen in the course of colonialism, the social and cultural networks and relationships that were annihilated or radically reformulated as a result of colonization were also material losses. Colonial dispossession not only determined the contemporary distribution of material wealth, but also radically altered subjectivity in the sense of what people desire, consider themselves as entitled to, and understand themselves to be. Theft of intangibles such as economic growth and prospects, opportunities, life chances, psyches, futures, and dreams all occur in all colonial contexts, settler or otherwise, although the discourse tends to be narrowly focused on returning objects in the British Museum when we think about what was stolen in the course of colonial conquest. The effect of the 1981 Act, along with changes to immigration law, was to put the wealth of Britain out of reach of the vast majority of people racialized through colonial processes, most of whom with histories of colonialism. Immigration law, however, not only serves as the means of obstruction of movement, it is also the means through which legal status is granted. While critiques of recognition are well established in settler colonial studies, the same critique hasn't been made in relation to Britain. Regimes of legal status recognition, whereby British authorities determine entitlement to statuses such as citizenship, settlement, or indefinite leave to remain, or refugee status, serve to legitimize the claim that colonial wealth, as it manifests in Britain, belongs behind its borders only to be accessed with permission. Similar to the way in which Indigenous people in Canada and Australia must submit to the rules and evidentiary standards of those colonial legal systems in order to be recognized as having enforceable rights to land, those with ancestral, geographical, and personal histories of British colonialism who wish to access stolen colonial wealth and resources in Britain must submit to the rules and evidentiary standards of British immigration law. In this way, a fiction of racial inclusion has been written into the form of paths to legal status, which dole out immigration statuses to a select group of racialized people who can fulfill certain criteria. This kind of recognition is always on the terms of the colonial state. Meanwhile, the vast majority of racialized people are prevented from accessing Britain and its wealth, in part through the operation of internal and external borders. The bestowal of British subjecthood or citizenship, as it's known in its current guise, can thus never be anything other than a colonial act. In the colonial era, British subjecthood was held up as a superior category from which the civilizing benefits of British rule flowed. Yet colonialism was genocide, mass murder, slavery, dispossession of land, exploitation of labor, theft of resources, all predicated on white British supremacy. Even so-called free British subjects who were racialized and who sought to move to different parts of the British Empire were met with racist immigration laws in places such as Canada and Australia. British subjecthood did not therefore protect racialized people from the violence of white British supremacy. Its very existence as a legal category was a manifestation of that violence. Whenever it has suited the British government, it has treated its subjects as aliens for legal purposes, evicting them from the scope of legal status and protection with devastating consequences. We saw this with the effect of the hostile environment policy, which was to deny many of the Windrush generation and their children access to healthcare, housing, employment, and other vital services, and to detain and expel them. The traditional acceptance of legal categories as defined in international and domestic law has the effect of concealing law's role in producing racialized subject and racial violence. It prevents us from being able to understand law as racial violence. Take, for example, the category of the refugee, relatively valorized as compared with the irregularized migrant. Individuals falling outside of the legal definition of a refugee are often described as illegal or irregular or economic migrants and are at risk of being removed and denied access to vital healthcare, housing, and work. A decision to deny legal status carries serious, sometimes fatal consequences. If we can address the historical contingency and artificiality of legal categories, the violence in their production and ongoing material effects, we can understand how Britain remains colonially and racially configured. It will also hopefully open up the way to develop more emancipatory and reparative discourses and strategies for migrant solidarity and racial justice. Because legal status does not alter the way in which racialized people are cast in white spaces as undeserving guests, outsiders, and intruders, as here today, but potentially gone tomorrow. Immigration law is the prop that is used to teach white British citizens that what Britain plundered from its colonies is theirs and theirs alone. Immigration law is not therefore the seemingly harsh but fair mode through which the deserving are separated from the undeserving. Instead, it is a crucial mechanism for ensuring that colonial wealth remains out of the hands of those from whom it was stolen. Racialized people in Britain, whether categorized as citizens, migrants, refugees, or asylum seekers, are habitually understood as having come from somewhere else. Britain's post-colonial articulation of its borders and national identity has driven the assumption that anyone who is not white could not be from Britain. Manifestations of this assumption are heard daily across Britain, whether in the form of the subtly disguised racist question, "Where do you come from originally?" or the avowed racist slur, "Go back to where you came from." In 2013, Theresa May's Home Office plastered the decree, "Go home or face arrest," on vans commissioned to drive around London in areas where racialized people live. Leave, which became the designation for the campaign for Britain's withdrawal from the European Union, began to take on a double meaning, embodying the go home dictum as a rejection of anyone deemed to be a migrant. Meanwhile, people considered not to have a legal right to remain in Britain are expelled to places that are not home. The legal system thus enacts the go home decree, the deportation flights carried forward by the justification that people without legal status do not belong in Britain. While racism drives these utterances and enactments, they are also propelled by something else, the idea that Britain is somewhere and not everywhere. If we take a critique that is post-colonial, we can think of a way through what law teaches to what I call a counter-pedagogy to that of law. Immigration law's lesson is one of differentiation in human worth and the crystallization of racial hierarchies through legal categories. For the colonial British state to function, it has always depended on Britons, 87% of whom are white, to imbibe a sense of entitlement and superiority over racialized people. Immigration, refugee, and citizenship law regimes, in their legitimization of differentiated access to resources according to immigration status, convey the lesson that the British national project is one of white ownership of colonial spoils, a project which is under constant threat from people who do not belong in Britain. A post-colonial critique of immigration law, which understands it as ongoing colonial violence, disrupts what law teaches, forcing an analysis of contemporary movement that accounts for colonial histories and legacies. So what might some of the contents of this counter-pedagogy to that of law look like? So-called host states should be understood as colonial spaces, and a regularized movement as anti-colonial resistance. By calling for a thinking of irregularized migration as anti-colonial resistance, I'm not relying on a reformist strategy which would require nation states or international organizations to introduce measures which might facilitate a more redistributive migration regime. First, as Leah Cowan writes, the current border regime demonstrates that the state will never meaningfully legislate for open, relaxed, or no borders, because to do so would be to blur the edges of its own power. Second, although limited redistribution occurs as a result of immigration, for instance, via the practice of sending back remittances and the physical direction of resources towards migrants present in Britain, the facilitation of migration in and of itself does little to contest broader ongoing colonial structures. Remittances, for instance, do little in the way of building the autonomy or infrastructure of former colonies. Nor am I proposing irregularized migration as a practical strategy for resisting ongoing colonial violence in the form of immigration and border control. This is not to deny that irregularized migration can be seen as embodying a practice of resistance in contesting the border and forcing a redistributive element into the relationship between Britain and its former colonies. Indeed, it is precisely the irregularity, the illegality of the relationship that gives irregularized migration its radical anti-colonial, reparative and redistributive dimension. In being illegal, it amounts to a forcible return of something that was stolen in a context in which the laws being breached, immigration and border controls, are designed specifically to obstruct such an outcome. Nevertheless, irregularized people are made vulnerable to extreme conditions of racial terror, both in their journeys and attempts to cross borders, as well as in their efforts to navigate legal status processes and hostile environments pre and post arrival. Rather, the reconceptualization I offer of irregularized migration as anti-colonial resistance is intended as an insistence on a recognition that the mainstream and accepted story of Britain's making is fiction. The story serves to justify the violence and injustice of Britain's contemporary border regime. Rather than being seen as rightfully at the mercy of legal status recognition processes, racialized people must both be understood and understand themselves as being collectively entitled to reclaiming wealth accumulated via colonial dispossession. There's an urgent need for a politics of migrant solidarity and racial justice in colonial contexts, which resists that of state recognition. We must acknowledge the connections between historical and ongoing racial projects of capitalist accumulation and contemporary migration movements, and question former colonial powers' claims to legitimate and defensible sovereign borders. Much scholarship, including the field in which I work, which is legal scholarship, is implicated in propagating an ahistorical discourse which fails to address the role of immigration and refugee law concepts in sustaining the structures and discourse which enable and legitimize conditions of racial violence. And we, of course, see these discourses reproduced in the media daily. Understanding how Britain came to be one of the wealthiest places in the world and how immigration law is deployed to exclude from its national project those at whose expense Britain was built is an important step towards formulating internationalist, anti-imperialist racial justice strategies. Colonial subjects dispossessed of resources and then of access to Britain were intrinsic to its making. As George Orwell wrote in 1939, the overwhelming bulk of the British proletariat does not live in Britain, but in Asia and Africa. He described the British Empire as nothing but a mechanism for exploiting cheap coloured labour. Aditya Mukherjee has shown how at the heart of colonialism lay surplus appropriation from the colony to the metropolis. In the case of India, unrequited transfers, whereby the colony paid for the exports of its own products to Britain, served as a massive and protracted drain on the Indian economy, while simultaneously contributing to Britain's economic sustenance and growth, a pattern repeated across the empire. The fact that colonized populations grew and sustained the British economy is juxtaposed with the habitual official denial that Britain owes anything to those it enslaved and colonized. This erasure manifests in part through the refusal to engage in processes which would see Britain pay reparations to colonized nations. In 2015, then Prime Minister David Cameron, on a visit to Jamaica, refused to apologize or engage on the question of payment of reparations for Britain's role in transatlantic slavery, preferring instead to move on from this painful legacy and continue to build for the future. The future building Cameron was particularly interested in was the £25 million British aid-funded prison to which people with Jamaican nationality convicted of criminal offences in Britain could be sent to serve out their sentences. Though this project wasn't implemented, Britain has contributed to such prison building projects in Nigeria, another of its former colonies. So to conclude, the Imperial Vanishing Act, performed by changes to immigration and nationality laws in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, cast Britain's imperial history into the shadows. The British Empire, about which most Britons know little, can be remembered fondly as a moment of past glory, as a gift once given to the world. The erasure has been so complete that Conservative MP Liam Fox could declare in 2016 that the United Kingdom is one of the few countries in the European Union that does not need to bury its 20th century history. And in 2019, the British government could take umbrage at the European Union's perfectly accurate description of Gibraltar in a legal document as a British colony. In announcing itself as post-colonial, Britain cut itself off symbolically and physically from its colonies and the Commonwealth, taking with it what it had plundered. While Britain may appear to be an island, it is in fact everywhere. The British Empire's legacies of racism, slavery, labor exploitation, land dispossession, bordering and plunder are to this day felt viscerally across the world. It is only with the confinement of British colonialism to the past that its former subjects, whether categorized today as citizens, migrants, refugees, or asylum seekers, can be understood to have come from somewhere else. If Britain is acknowledged as being everywhere, its colonial legacy still reaching like tentacles across the world, then Britain is where we are from. In this way, the dictum "go home" becomes paradoxically, subversively, an invitation to stay. Thank you.
Thank you very much appreciate that. And now we have Leah. Leah Cowan is the former politics editor at the award-winning magazine Galdem. She works at Project 17. It's an advice centre which supports migrant family with no recourse to public funds. And regrettably, that is so common that it actually has its own acronym, NRPF. She speaks on race, gender and migration, and she's written for Vice, Open Democracy, Refinery 29 and The Guardian. Remember that we'll be taking questions after both Nadine and Leah have spoken. So store them up, write them in the Q&A section. And meanwhile, welcome to Leah. Looking forward to what you've got to say.
Thanks so much, Deborah. And yeah, I'm equally overjoyed to be sharing this forum with Nadine today. I have my camera off, but rest assured I was kind of nodding emphatically at everything Nadine was saying. So thank you so much for your talk. I'm going to talk a bit about the book that I've just published, Border Nation, what it's about and why I wrote it. And then I'll kind of use that as a leaping off point to delve a bit deeper into some of the themes of the book around the current hostile environment and resistance to the border regime in the UK. So the book is a kind of radical introduction to Britain's borders, and radical in the true sense of really scrutinizing the fundamental nature of what borders are and how they came about. So looking very closely at Britain's colonial history and the key role that Britain has played in colonizing and invading in different ways throughout history, the majority of the world, and thinking about how that links to the oppressive border regime that we now live in. And so it's about joining the dots between Britain's kind of marauding colonial past and the present day hostile environment, which is this kind of web of policies knit together by a political agenda which seeks to make life in the UK pretty untenable for so-called migrant communities. And I say so-called because we can look at, for example, the Windrush Scandal, within which Caribbean elders who came to the UK between 1948 and 1970 were being targeted for deportation by the Home Office. So this is elders, people like my grandparents who came over from Jamaica in the 50s, who have lived here for many, many years, perhaps identify very proudly as British, called the UK their home, being told in the most violent way possible that they do not belong. And the Windrush Scandal, I think, is a very pertinent example of the brutality of Britain's border regime and the impossibility for racialized people to be able to ever truly transcend non-whiteness into Britishness, which is congruent with citizenship and belonging in this country, the seeds for which were sown many centuries ago with things like the colonial projects and the transatlantic slave trade. And Nadine's book and her work that you've just been hearing about sets out very clearly how, as she says, immigration law and border enforcement is on a continuum of colonialism, in that it maintains the racial project of capitalist accumulation. And so I wrote the book because I wanted to create what I hope is a relatively kind of digestible piece of literature, which brings together information about Britain's border in one place. So whether we're talking about immigration detention or deportation or right to rent checks or racist media reporting throughout the migrant crisis, which peaked maybe around 2015, in which we saw a vast amount of people dying trying to get to safety across the Mediterranean Sea, and so on. All of these elements are part of the border regime. Yet when I was first learning about this, I was struggling to find information which looked at the interplay between these different pieces, as well as the historical foundations of inequality, which have produced the current border regime. And so I wanted to create something that felt readable for a range of people, including people who may have some understanding of the violence of borders, whether through their lived experience or their own reading or work on the topic, or perhaps no real grounding in border politics at all, but a sense that the myth of the border, that, for example, some people deserve to be in the UK and some people don't, didn't really add up. So I wanted to create this book to kind of provide a way for people to start to unpick the complexity of Britain's border and set the scene for a real kind of questioning around the status quo of why it exists in the way that it does today. And my journey to writing the book comes from both kind of personal and political dimensions, and of course the two are intertwined. So my work or organizing for the past 10-ish years has been in the migrants' rights and UK feminist movements, and my day jobs have been in the migrants' rights sector and what is known in the UK as the women's sector, or the gender-based violence sector, addressing interlocking issues such as domestic violence, state violence, sexual harassment, stalking, and so on. And what I saw through these experiences of working and organizing against these huge structures of oppression with long histories in this country was how the border is such a huge antagonist in so many people's lives. So, for example, I've spoken with migrant survivors trying to flee domestic violence, where perpetrators are threatening to cancel their visas if they report abuse to the police, and learned that specialist domestic violence refuges for women of colour and migrant women are being shut down and having their funding gutted by the Conservative government. So these survivors have nowhere to turn, let alone survivors for whom formalised kind of government-funded specialist refuges have never existed, such as trans women of colour and trans migrant women and migrant sex workers. Well, at the same time, the police are sharing data with the Home Office. So, for example, we see cases like in 2017 where a pregnant woman reported rape at a police station. She was taken into a sexual assault centre and there met with immigration enforcement, who took her into custody and interrogated her about her immigration status. I've also met people in immigration detention centres who are facing deportation to countries where their lives are at risk, or simply countries they do not call home. And I've met children in a refugee camp in Calais who are living uncomfortable, unsafe, precarious lives, waiting to be reunited with family in the UK. And all of these experiences of working together, organising together in solidarity with people whom the border has crossed. And there is that great slogan from the anti-border movement, which goes, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." And having conversations about what the harsh reality of the border actually is brought me to a point where I wanted to put that reality down in words, specifically focusing on Britain and Britain's role in this harm, and to contribute to the conversation that is already happening in different pockets, where the agreement really is that the enforcement of Britain's borders does not really need to exist, should not exist, and we can come together to start breaking them down. The kind of central premise of this is the idea that borders are a fiction created in the minds of ostensibly kind of white, powerful men to protect the interests of capital and money making. and to enable the wealth that has been hoarded in the colonial projects to stay in the country and pull up the drawbridge so that the people who that wealth really belongs to, largely people across the global south, can't access it. In particular in the book, I hope that I've managed to illustrate that the policing of everyday borders is very harmful to our friends, our family, our neighbours, our colleagues, the people that we see every day on our government mandated walks, the people in our communities, and that we should resist them at every turn, whether it's right to rent checks, making it difficult for people to rent somewhere to live, document checks and charges in hospital settings and for pregnant people and people giving birth, whether it's the policing and harassment of migrant sex workers or people who are trying to open bank accounts. All of these elements of the hostile environment are things that we can push back against, and I would argue must chip away at as part of a larger goal to break down borders. And the final chapter in the book kind of talks about the resistance that is already happening in this country and hopefully provides some inspiration and fire for bellies that are hungry for a different world, one that I believe is within our grasp, even if the road to get there is long. I think the other thing that I hope the book kind of demonstrates is that Britain has a long history that extends far beyond its own shores. And the failure to reckon with that history continues into the present day. And I know that Nadine's writings and her book, Bordering Britain, which I think is linked in the chat, covers in kind of very forensic detail a lot of ground in terms of laying out the colonial roots of the immigration laws that we currently live with and their development, which prop up the border. And I'm very interested in this almost historical amnesia, which is present in the institutions of Britain. And I watched a short documentary about James Baldwin the other day, the American writer, called James Baldwin in Paris. And there's this one really great line where he's in an art studio with this great turtleneck and a whiskey in hand, and he sits back and says, "I would not be a white American for all the tea in China, all the oil in Texas. I really wouldn't like to have to live with all those lies." And it made me really think about the incredible weight of white supremacy, the fictions and the merry dances that uphold it. And one of those is this idea that Britain is a kind of benign little quaint sailboat bobbing alone on a sparkling sea, and that it's a country that just got lucky and got rich. Obviously, that's not how the world works. The Industrial Revolution and the wealth hoarded in this country was generated on the back of our enslaved ancestors and the exploitation and oppression of working class people, including migrant communities in Britain. And we only have to look to something like the NHS and the great kind of pressures and chronic underfunding of the NHS to see a clear example of that. The way in which in a pandemic, a hugely kind of disproportionate amount of people of colour, healthcare workers are dying on the front lines and across society, and yet the government brings in successive immigration acts to block access to migrant communities for that very public service. And the other missing piece of this discussion is the fact that when Britain went marauding around the world, invading kind of 90% of countries, it left a long-lasting imprint and constructed a particular ideology or way of thinking about Britain in relation to the rest of the world. And this imprint is alive and well and impacting people's lives in the present day. So the continuation of the colonial project lives and breathes in the current context of the hostile environment. So we've seen, particularly in the last decade, via the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Acts, the ramping up of what we might refer to as everyday borders. So rather than the border just being reinforced at the periphery of a country, at a port of entry, we see people within our communities being turned into de facto border guards by immigration laws. For example, now we know that there is a piece of legislation called Right to Rent, which came in kind of 2014, 2015, which means that landlords now have to check ID documents, kind of papers for tenants and lodgers, or risk a fine or jail time. And in practice, this means that landlords are less likely to rent to people who don't have a British passport or kind of straightforward documentation proving their right to reside, or any documentation at all for that matter. And in research carried out by the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, the JCWI, because of right to rent, over a quarter of landlords surveyed would be reluctant to rent to somebody with, I quote, a foreign sounding name. This is one example of the border being reinforced from within the country. Another example of this is the kind of immigration checks and charges for secondary care in healthcare settings, and the sharing of some data with the Home Office, although this has been reduced through the Patients Not Passports campaign. In practice, this means that people are scared to access healthcare, or simply can't afford to access it, or they accumulate huge debts through things like giving birth. And the same types of checks and barriers occur in educational settings, when people are trying to set up bank accounts and more. And this is the hostile environment at play. This is Theresa May's stated aim in 2012, that she wanted to make life for, I think her exact wording was illegal immigrants, but the kind of in practice, what that means is migrant communities and racialized people untenable. And these are the bits of the border that we can begin to chip away at when we are working towards abolition and building more caring and compassionate communities. Another key pillar of the border regime presently in the UK, which I talk about in the book, is immigration detention. And just for some kind of quick stats, there are 7 detention centres or immigration removal centres in the UK, and they are effectively category B high security prisons. Under current immigration law, a person can be detained indefinitely, and Britain is the only country in Europe to do this, at any point if they don't have the right to remain in the UK or if their application is pending. A person is most likely to be detained on arrival or when seeking asylum, if a claim is refused, or if they are picked up by a raid or a spot check by immigration enforcement. And what's particularly alarming about detention is that it is officially an administrative process and not a criminal procedure, which means that people can be detained, again, indefinitely on the decision of an immigration official. And this decision doesn't have to be approved by a judge or a court. So basically, people can be locked up in this country without any kind of trial or oversight or scrutiny of the decision. Not that I would approve of locking people up in any scenario, but the point is that even by the laws of the land, immigration detention is incredibly shady and questionable. All this to say, it's apparent to me that reform of the border apparatus isn't the answer, that this practice of locking people up and deporting people needs to end, and any small changes, whether it's having a detention centre just for women or reducing the amount of children held in UK immigration detention, and the UK does still detain children, including unaccompanied minors, it's not enough. It doesn't end the harm. It doesn't get to the root of the problem that the border regime creates. What is needed is abolition of these centres and practices as we move towards abolition of border violence altogether. Anything else is just kind of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Whatever reforms you make, the underlying issue of detention and deportation, the deprivation of liberty, will still exist. Detention centres serve a political and a monetary purpose. So they're profit-making ventures for private companies. All of the detention centres in the UK, except for Morton Hall in Lincolnshire, are run by private companies. And they also suit government agendas, as politicians can point to detention and say that they are being tough on immigration. With detention centres, it's clear that they exist to serve a political purpose. People's lives are being used as pawns in this incredibly sinister game that politicians play about trying to look tough on immigration. And we know that it's a performance because detention centres don't even meet their stated aim in the past decade, The proportion of people who are removed or deported after being detained has nearly halved, and yet 25,000 people a year continue to be locked up indefinitely. And people incarcerated in immigration detention are disproportionately people of colour and asylum seekers. Detention centres aren't, for the most part, full of white Americans and Canadians who've overstayed their tourist visas, for example. It's a very specific demographic of people who get profiled and locked up indefinitely. And there's not a lot known about immigration detention in the public sphere. This, I think, is for a range of reasons. For one, journalists aren't allowed inside immigration detention centres, so it's very hard to report on the issue. The other fact is that as the actual kind of infrastructure of immigration detention centres has developed and become more robust and resilient, we've seen less incidents that draw media attention, such as large fires. It's much harder to get a journalist to report on a story where there aren't really any visuals. People inside detention don't have access to the internet or camera phones, so it's really difficult to represent beyond verbatim testimonies, which you can read online at Detained Voices, what is happening inside. So people don't really know about immigration detention. Everybody that I've spoken to who's outside of the kind of academic sphere of working on migration issues or outside of the kind of third sector migration field is always very shocked to learn about their existence. So there's a big kind of education and public awareness piece that is being tirelessly worked on by campaigners to kind of raise attention towards that issue. And the other issue, I think, in dismantling this aspect of the border apparatus, in particular immigration detention and deportation, is that immigration detention sits at this nexus of two ideas, I think, in the public imagination: the migrant and the prison. And in the public imagination, prisons need to exist and they keep us safe, and people locked up inside them are dangerous or a threat. On top of that, after over a decade of hostile environment rhetoric, on top of many more racist decades leaping off from the Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, and the kind of violence, treat and state racism that followed, on top of centuries of oppression through colonialism and slavery, the idea of the migrant is something that has been intensively vilified in the public imagination. So a prison for migrants is basically the perfect concoction for a right-wing and or hostile environment loving audience. The idea that some people deserve to be in the UK and some don't is such a rigid concept to try and dismantle, and the work is being done to break this down, but it is slow and steady work. Which brings me on to a kind of vital part of discussions around the border regime, which is resistance to it. And I'm just going to read a section from the last chapter of the book. In the face of the extreme violence of borders, this relentless onslaught which pounds like waves, we must fight back, even when it feels like trying to battle the tide. Rejecting borders and the border nation is not a simple act. When people ask me if a borderless world is possible, I answer that many people are already rejecting borders through crossing them and living across them in defiance of state laws and interests. We have to dream bigger and bolder than the narrow confines of Home Office checkboxes, bars, and barbed wire. We already have so much to be inspired by and living evidence that a better world is possible. To explain why pursuing no borders is the route to survival and justice, I could describe the individual struggles of countless people and communities who are living at the sharp edge of border regimes. From young children suspended in limbo in refugee camps to families dealing with immense struggle as their constant companion, as they're afraid to claim welfare support or interact with state agencies, the border nation wields an everyday violence and restricts our right to live freely. Running as a thread throughout all of these lives is the structural inequality that is baked into the border system and immigration policies. The set of scales which weighs up the value of human life and kicks out or pushes down those deemed not crucial to the state's vision for itself. Effective resistance cannot be about simply saving individuals or trying to improve an inherently violent state, but must also prioritize the urgent need to overturn a system that wishes us dead. As Gary Young writes in Red Pepper in 2018, examining the very question of a world without borders, if politics is the art of the possible, then radicalism must be the capacity to imagine new possibilities. There is scope and energy to imagine a world with no borders, even if, and perhaps precisely because, it feels out of reach. It's crucial to bear in mind that, particularly in the context of a hostile environment, legal challenges and policy change are incredibly difficult to enact. We will never convince the government to dismantle its own power, but this doesn't mean it isn't worth attempting to make short-term improvements to the material realities of people crossing borders in the meantime. Equally useful is migrant communities and allies coming together to effect change from the grassroots up, pushing back against state violence, disrupting systems of harm, and replacing them with autonomous communities of care. The call to defund police and abolish prisons in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020 are part of this long-term struggle. We can only destroy the border, both physical and mental, by reaching across it in solidarity. Acting in solidarity requires recognizing the different amounts of power and privilege we all have in relation to each other. Speaking in a YouTube video, Angela Davies explains the concept of solidarity in relation to joining up struggles between people inside and outside of prison. Solidarity has nothing to do with charity in the conventional sense. When we speak about solidarity, we have a respect for the knowledge that's produced by people behind bars and a commitment to break down the hierarchies that almost inevitably begin to insert themselves into relationships between people on the outside and people on the inside. Solidarity in this context means, as far as possible, being led by the needs, skills, knowledge, and actions of people directly and most starkly affected by border violence. Angela Davis also spoke in June 2020 about the need to look towards trans and non-binary movement leaders in the pursuit of different ways of resisting and living, remarking that this community has taught us how to challenge that which is totally accepted as normal. If it is possible to challenge the gender binary, then we can certainly effectively resist prisons and jails and police. We must take care in our organising to centre and be led by minoritized and marginalised people crossing borders, which includes people who are trans, disabled, neurodiverse, survivors, sex workers, Indigenous, and more, as people who are most targeted by the border nation create and hold the necessary knowledge for surviving and fighting back against it. Solidarity means acting in a way that doesn't seek to save more deserving individuals or groups of people, but in a way that has eradication of the inherently unequal border and the forces that uphold it as its driving goal. Supporting protests against border violence and efforts to move and live across borders that are led by migrant communities, including people inside detention, are a crucial driving part of this work. And I just wanted to finish by reading about one example of resistance to the border regime, which is all kind of tied into this global movement to dismantle borders. And it's about the hunger strikes that happened in 2018 in Yarlswood, which is an immigration removal centre in Bedford, where mainly women are incarcerated. Protests at Yarlswood IRC are relatively frequent, with actions of resistance hitting the headlines every couple of years, including a strike in 2005 over poor healthcare provision. In 2018, over 100 women in Yarlswood began the Hunger for Freedom all-out strike, refusing to eat or work and calling for an end to indefinite detention and charter flights, improved access to healthcare, and an end to the £1 an hour wage for working in detention. In their list of demands, which they published on the Detained Voices website, they stated, "Everyone in detention is unfairly treated, and all we want is a fair process. This is the only option we are left with to express how we feel. We will not eat till we are free." Protests were also held by people detained inside Harmondsworth IRC and Campsfield House in Oxford in 2006 and 2007. The 2006 unrest in Harmondsworth reportedly began after a guard switched off TV news coverage of a damning government report on the centre, which had been published that day. The report, which the Chief Inspector of Prisons described as undoubtedly the poorest report we have issued on an IRC, noted that 60% of people inside felt unsafe and pointed to an endemic issue of overemphasis on physical security and control. After the TV was switched off, a protest erupted, with people in detention reportedly being physically beaten and locked inside as fires broke out. Riot teams were called in as people in detention gathered in the courtyard and used bed sheets to spell out SOS and freedom to media helicopters which had begun to fly overhead. As is common with detention riots, attempts were made to prosecute the protesters for violent disorder. In this case, they were acquitted. Since the mid-noughties, detention protests have been numerous but generally smaller, in part attributable to newer detention centres being constructed with much more durable and solid components. As Corporate Watch notes, resistance has not dissolved but has developed in new forms. Platforms like Detained Voices are used to expose abuse, and hunger strikes are used to draw attention to the inhumane living conditions in the centres and demand an end to the discriminatory asylum system. Often these forms of protest do not garner the same levels of media attention and public interest as a huge blaze might. Resistance will always shapeshift and adapt to realities, and people inside and outside detention continue to act in solidarity with each other. Detention is not a process meted out on lone individuals. One person being threatened with deportation means everyone is at risk. Thanks.
Thank you very much both for your presentations. That's very interesting. We do have some questions starting. We've got one from Clive H. Price, and I'm going to try and unmute you, Clive. Right. Has that given you permission in there? I can ask Clive's question. There he is. I've just tried to unmute you, Clive.
Is that it?
Yeah, we can hear you. Fantastic.
Are you getting me now? Yeah.
Yep, you've got two questions I can see. There's one for Nadine and there's one for both women. Why don't you just ask them at the same time?
Well, I was thinking the same thing, actually. I think Leah has partially covered both questions, really. Yeah, so the two questions essentially was what difference, if any, would make between people seeking immigration to any country where there was a history of colonialism and where there wasn't. In other words, I mean, how would you treat, for example, I don't know, Indonesians where there's no specific British colonialism and Kenyans, for example. The second question was relates to the climate emergency and one of the accepted outcomes of the climate emergency, if we don't do something about it very quickly and very urgently, which seems there's no particular chance of happening anytime soon, in spite of the efforts of Greta Thunberg and many others. What are the practicalities of immigration situations in those circumstances where the trickle is likely to become a flood? Yeah, did you get all that?
Yes, I certainly heard it all. Who of you would like to go first?
I don't mind.
I can come in first on the question that was addressed to me on the distinctions. I think one thing to point out is that whilst it may be true to some extent that there are countries where Britain didn't have a direct colonial relationship, I mean, that's in the book, it's not, the argument is not made in such a clear-cut way as to say that it is only those from countries where Britain had a colonial history that should be entitled to travel to Britain. It is to say that Britain's immigration law is ongoing colonial violence, and therefore Britain cannot be understood as being a legitimately bordered sovereign nation state. So this begins to allow us to pick apart its borders. And I think that Leah also gave us lots of ways to begin to think beyond a bordered Britain. And indeed, Britain's borders are not justified or legitimate if we consider British immigration law as colonial theft, as being part of a colonial edifice that prevents people from whom wealth was stolen from accessing it today. The other point that I'd make on this is that Britain's legacy of racism, or the legacy of white supremacy, there is no corner of the world that has not been touched by that. So it doesn't, so in that sense, sort of saying, drawing some clear-cut distinction between countries that been colonized and those that didn't, isn't necessarily that helpful if what we're looking at is the structures, patterns, trends, realities that exist in a world that is post-British supremacy, but post-British Empire, which was predicated on white British supremacy. And so those structures and those legacies of racism are felt across the world. And so I think once that is brought to bear on your question, again, it becomes not that helpful to think about drawing distinctions between people with who might be seen as having a right to cross Britain's borders and those that don't. The other thing is, I generally don't think it's helpful, and I don't myself draw distinctions between people's rights to cross borders. I think that the way in which it's precisely the drawing of distinctions that is at the heart of the violence that takes place. And I think that's what I was trying to outline at the beginning of my talk in talking about categorization as a tool of violence, both in the context of racial hierarchies that are then transposed and given force through law, which also works on the basis of drawing distinctions and hierarchies. And those distinctions and hierarchies don't actually map onto reality. The so-called motivations for people's movement, the so-called categories people are said to fall within, don't actually map neatly onto people's actually lived experience, lives, desires, dreams. Sometimes people would more accurately be seen as falling across categories, but really those categories serve to distort the reality. So again, I would just say to be wary of any kinds of categorization or distinctions when we're talking about people and their lived experience and realities. But I'll stop there and pass on to Leah to add on to that and also to address the climate change one, but I'm happy to come back in on that if there's time after.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of echo what Nadine said. I think the kind of categorizing of people works to create this kind of strata of what I was talking about earlier, the kind of deserving and undeserving migrant, where you get kind of, you know, economic migrants over here and LGBT asylum seekers over here and children and women here and someone who served a criminal sentence over here. And when you have that break people down into those categories and that strata, it then makes it easy to kind of cherry pick, you know, these people can cross the border and this massive category of people can't. So I would agree, Nadine, that I would kind of not kind of move towards that approach. In terms of the question around climate change, I think it's a really important one and very pertinent to this discussion, because obviously Britain is one of the biggest contributors to kind of global temperature change, and the top 7 most affected countries who are most affected by climate change are in sub-Saharan Africa. So you see how Britain has played such a key role in the kind of degradation of the environment, and actually the countries that are left to deal with this massive challenge are those who are least resourced to deal with it because of the impacts and the legacy and ongoing kind of neo-colonial acts of Britain. So I think it's a very important question that's pertinent to this issue of borders and the historical origins of borders. I think the policies would have to be about recognizing just that, recognizing that the damage that has been done to the environment falls very squarely at Britain's doorstep, and therefore kind of resources and money needs to be put into that as a kind of reparative approach to repairing the harm that's been done. I don't know if you want to add onto that, Nadine.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said, Leah. I think I would also just say that, and I'm not saying this is what you're doing, Clive, but it's just often the this question around when migration is brought together with the question of the climate crisis, I think it's worrying the way sometimes the issue of addressing climate change is in order to prevent what we fear in terms of the movement of so-called mass movements of people or mass migration. I think this is problematic because it of course buys into that idea that movement is itself something to be prevented, something negative. It creates this sort of fear of migration, which I think both Leah and I have been very careful to avoid and to critique that discourse. And I think the other thing that it misses is that the climate crisis and border violence both work to disproportionately harm racialized people. Border violence and climate crisis can actually both be seen as symptoms of the larger problem, which is racial capitalism and some of the neo-colonial forms of violence that Leah was talking about, you know, uneven trade and debt arrangements, global poverty, which of course are felt viscerally, most viscerally, in places, in countries that are not white, in countries that are predominantly not white. So what we're doing when we think about, oh, well, what policies can we put in place to deal with the fact we haven't dealt with the climate crisis in relation to migration? What we're doing is we're trying to treat symptoms rather than causes. And we're also missing who are the victims of these structures which continue to dispossess the most historically dispossessed in the world already. So again, I would just sort of encourage a reframing of the thinking and the question to one, to always be careful that we're not talking about migration as something that we should be afraid of. We shouldn't be talking in terms of mass migration, because again, the terms of mass migration suggest that there is an amount of migration that might be seen as too high. This is a fundamentally racist idea, the idea that it is possible to have too many people in a white space that might tip the balance the wrong way. I mean, that's essentially what lies at the heart of any kind of discussion around migration being too high or the numbers of migrants being too high. So I would just stay away from all of that sort of language and think really carefully about what are the problems here. The climate crisis, border violence, and then think about treating the causes of that. And that would be addressing the racial capitalist system in which we're all forced to live and are differentially harmed by it in various ways.
This sort of interests me, the whole thing, because well, you pointed out, I think it was Nadine actually, pointed out that this whole historical situation has affected not only people in former colonies, but it also sort of affected the working classes and what we now have as an underclass in the UK too, because the money that was taken wasn't shared out equally, was it? So if you're going to, really, this is a far bigger question. How do you get hold of that money and make sure that it's spent equitably instead of just requiring a country that has sort of, for the most part, law-abiding taxpayers to kind of redress the balance?
Can I come in there again?
Sure. I'll just add to that. I've just finished watching a documentary about how the sort of shadow banking system started after it was called the sort of second colonial surge, if you like, where the first colonial surge was just going in and taking things, and the second colonial was making sort of just unaccountable banking systems all over the country. So people who are really wealthy still don't share it.
That's very true. Yeah, 2 points, I think, if I may. Excuse me. First of all, I think racism is not endemic to white Europeans. I mean, you only got to look at China and the Uyghur situation at the moment, and you can get another Middle East or 101 other instances. It's a fundamental, unfortunately, trait of human nature. So I think that is a factor we've got to address in reality. The second thing is taking Nadine's point on as far as climate change is concerned. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should look at migration as from a point of view of look at climate change, I should say, from a point of view of migration. It would be a result of the failure of the economic system to price in natural resources, essentially, and the widespread use of fossil fuel and burning carbon. So it's not that I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's a prime cause or should be looked at as a way of addressing climate change. It will be an unfortunate result of our inaction in the wider sense.
Okay, thank you, Clive. I tell you what I'll do as well is I'm going to if our guests want to address that's absolutely fine. I'll also go on to, because we've got one more question here. This is from Stephen, and I'm just about to unmute you, Stephen. So if you're there, are you unmuted? Can you speak? Okay, I can't hear you, but I'll ask the question on your behalf. Some people with older versions of Zoom have difficulty with this. It's no big deal. If the long-term solution to borders is public education, so these policies are no longer electorally popular, should government push back and attempt the attempt to start culture wars? For example, should there be legislations on statues, flags, and criticism of Black Lives Matter, etc. So should the government be involved in those kinds of culture wars which fuel all this, or is this just a distraction which should be ignored? What do our speakers think?
I think should the government be involved in attempting to start culture wars? I mean,
to suppress them because
I think the question is asking, Leah, whether we ought to engage with the government's attempt to start culture wars, and it's using the examples of legislation on statues, flags, etc., or whether we should just ignore this because it's a distraction. Sorry, Deborah, I think that might be what Stephen's saying.
Oh yeah, what I think, I'm trying to read it and interpret it at the same time. It's he clearly wrote very fast, but I think what he's saying is this is the long-term solution to this borders issue. For a start, is to cut down on the culture wars. So should the government be involved in suppressing the culture wars, which we do? Should there be legislation on statues, flags, that kind of thing? The kind of things that the National Front, for example, or white supremacist groups used to use.
I don't know that I fully understand the question, so I might pass over to Nadine because I think you had a clearer read on it.
Sure. I would like to just come back on something that Clive said, because I think that it's important to challenge the idea that racism is part of human nature. I wouldn't want to in any way agree with that, or to leave anybody with the impression that I would agree with that. I don't think that racism is part of human nature. I think that it is, again, a symptom, but also a tool that is used in a manipulative way by those in power in order to divide people and to ensure that the capitalist system, which requires people to essentially compete for what are presented as resources which are scarce, which of course are not scarce, they're just located in the hands of a few, as I think, Deborah, you were also referring to earlier when you talked about the question of class, because of course we are all the vast majority of us are impacted in differential ways, but nevertheless impacted and dispossessed through the capitalist system, which is mobilized, in which things like racism are mobilized cynically in order to construct the idea that particular people within society are the reason for other people's dispossession. So the migrant, the gang member, previously the mugger, etc., were all held up as the reason for the fact that the vast majority of people live in poverty without access to healthcare services, the basic means of life. But that is, of course, a cynical ruse to keep wealth in the hands of the few, to put it crudely. We can actually look across the world and within our own communities and our own neighborhoods for quite the opposite of something that looks like racism is human nature. We see people connecting, we see people reaching out to one another, we see people building movements together, as we've seen against the police bill in recent weeks, as we saw people come together in memory of Sarah Everard and against police brutality, as we saw with the mutual aid groups that emerged in the course of the pandemic, where people were really coming together and building bonds of love and solidarity and protecting one another and looking after one another, regardless of people's background, however they may be racialized. And those bonds of love and solidarity are particularly the kinds of bonds that the state cannot break, cannot divide us, cannot rule us. And I think that we need to look at those kinds of instances of people relating to one another, connecting with one another, to challenge notions that racism and exclusion and marginalization, dispossession are simply human nature and things we have to live with. Absolutely not. They are symptoms of the violent racial capitalist system, which is imposed on us by people who are interested in keeping it in place. Just to briefly address Stephen's question, I think it's a good question, because I think you're right that what we're seeing at the moment is the government starting a culture war. Again, I think it's part of this idea of trying to pit people against one another, to tell people that it's flags and patriotism that will save you, it's nationalism that will save you, and the people who are threatening you are the migrants, are the asylum seekers, are the refugees, they're trying to come and take what's yours. And it's precisely that kind of discourse and narrative that we have to resist. And I suppose in some sense, one way of resisting is to consider it distraction and to not engage. But it's difficult because of course it's a very pernicious, violent, and actually effective means of dividing people and constructing particular people as threats, who then become subjected to police violence in the form of stop and search, in the form of militarized policing on the streets. And so actually what we need to do is to build a kind of movement that is based on solidarity, that is based on collective forms of justice, of working together, of really stopping the government from being able to divide and rule us. And I think that one of the great things we're seeing in relation to the movements that we're seeing against the police bill at the moment is precisely this kind of coalitional movement of different groups who are targeted by the state in different ways, whether the traveller community, whether people excluded from school, whether sex workers, people who are racially victimized in the context of stop and search, all coming together to say no to authoritarianism, no to state violence, and coming together to essentially to resist the kinds of violences that we've been talking about today. Thanks.
Thank you ever so much, Nadine L Anneny. I'm so sorry, Nadine. And Leah, thank you ever so much for for being with us this afternoon. This has been an absolutely fascinating talk for Thinking on Sunday. To all of our listeners here, remember that Conway Hall is a charity. We depend entirely on donations to do the work that we do. So if you've got anything left over after we've all been locked down for a year, then please do donate it to Conway Hall. We do good work. It's a place the heart of London that continues to have these kinds of talks for good ideas for the future. Thank you ever so much to both of our speakers this afternoon, and see you next week for Thinking on Sunday.